Alcatraz Island is a paradox. It is at once a key element in a setting of spectacular scenic beauty and a remnant of a one-time habitat purposely designed to be among the worst in the world. Its ghostly battleship profile gazes back at the headlands of Marin. From the scenic vantage points of San Francisco's hills, it looms a monument to human failure and despair. From the east, the island Alcatraz, a solitary rock, is inseparable from the total vista of the city and its Golden Gate. Because of its scenic beauty, its mystery, or the glamour of its history, Alcatraz is a must-see to the millions of tourists that visit San Francisco each year. At Fisherman's Wharf and all around the city, souvenir hawkers peddle Alcatrazabilia, from swizzle sticks to sweatshirts. Coin-operated telescopes peer down from Telegraph Hill and dot the waterfront to provide the visitor with a close-up glimpse of the rock.
We out-of-towners, so we're just taking a look. And it's always been something fascinating to me, you know, that it would be a prison, you know, and then all of a sudden it's empty.
How about you folks? Anyone like to tell us why you're going to Alcatraz?
See relatives?
It's
Never been
it's
there.
something unique. It's a prison and it's something unique. There's no other prison like it, except maybe Devil's Island, maybe. It's different.
And I'm going with them because I've never been there, and it's the rock, and I like it. It'll be different. It's tourist. It's worldwide known, Alcatraz. A lot of history, all that. A lot of movies made about it.
To get even closer, thousands of tourists ride the hourly ferry around the island and listen to the recollections of a former Alcatraz guard.
I came back in 1980 as a park ranger, the only one to do so who formerly worked on that island. And my first few tours, I felt the trauma I felt as a young man working there on the island. I felt the depression, the way I felt depraved. You know, when you're constantly being taunted, you feel depressed, and I felt that while coming back. And I went through a couple of tours of working there, and I felt, boy, I just don't want to do this anymore. I want to get away from it. Well, the best thing I did, it was to stay there and face it out, because now I don't have depression anymore. I don't have that feeling of despondency, which I had when I worked there before as a correctional officer. And of course, the clientele is better now than it was 30 years ago too, so that makes it a lot better.
But the ultimate Alcatraz tourist experience is the National Park Service on-island tour. Annually, over 600,000 visitors enjoy one of the most spectacular boat rides in America, a quarter-hour cruise that features a panorama of postcard vistas of San Francisco, the bay and its shores. They depart to the island on the same dock as Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and Clint Eastwood. Visitors to Alcatraz are led by a specially trained National Parks ranger on a tour that includes the main cell block with a walk down the infamous Broadway. A visit to the dining hall, where the last meal served is still posted on the menu spaghetti board. Stroll across the yard, where inmates spent very few hours in the usually foggy fresh air. Hear the sounds of the big house. And experience the total darkness of the whole. Unlike today, the early visitors and inhabitants of the Bay Area, except the pelicans and other hardy marine birds, found little use for this 12 acres of barren rock. The Native Americans feared the evil spirits they believed dwelt there. Throughout almost 80 years of Spanish and Mexican rule, few ever visited, and no one stayed, on Isla de Alcatraz. Sparse of vegetation, beaten by the tides and winds of the Golden Gate, it was without purpose for humankind. With the United States military occupation after the war with Mexico, the value of Alcatraz as the key to the defensive fortification of the bay became apparent, and the conversion of the island from useless rock to military fort began with an Army survey in 1847 and became official with the executive order of President Fillmore, designating it a military reservation in 1850. In 1855, the first guns were mounted at the south end of the island, and by 1859, 75 guns were in place and the fortification was completed, including a 3-story citadel on the island plateau, 135 feet above the water. Remnants of that old fort are still visible today. The metamorphosis of Alcatraz began in 1861 when 13 military prisoners were transferred from the overcrowded guardhouse at the Presidio of San Francisco. On August 17th of that year began more than a century of incarcerating wayward soldiers, political prisoners, prisoners of war, and the most incorrigible of America's public enemies. In 1907, the outmoded fortifications were abandoned by the Army, and Alcatraz, stripped of its defensive role, became exclusively a military prison and disciplinary barracks. The 50-year-old citadel was demolished and a new cell house was built to hold 600 prisoners. Military prisoners in Alcatraz received the kind of hard labor treatment common for the times. They did construction, maintenance, manufacturing, and of course, rock breaking. Rule violators found themselves confined to their cells, sometimes handcuffed to the bars, and restricted to a diet of bread and water while in solitary confinement. Ordinarily, they spent their time making furniture and clothing for the military or working in the Army laundry. By 1933, the Army, motivated by the high cost of operating the island prison and embarrassed by its prominence on the bay, looked for a way out and found the United States Department of Justice an eager new tenant who turned it into a federal penitentiary like no other in America.
We took the Alcatraz from the military, and they left 32 prisoners on Alcatraz. So we took care of them until our men started coming in from the different institutions. Alcatraz was devised to take the troublemakers from the other prison institutions, and you know, they thought, well, it'd be good for the morale in the other institutions, which it was, because Alcatraz didn't give them much luxuries, you know. They held them down pretty good.
Alcatraz differed from the other
federal penitentiaries in the fact that it was so severe in its determining every move that was made by the inmates, rules and regulations that were never dreamed of in the other institutions. As an example, I had not seen a newspaper in 5 years, nor had I read a magazine, nor did I hear TV or see TV. In fact, I had never seen it. And we had no radios. Radios came in at a later date. They were very strict in everything they did. They did not tolerate any physical contact. There were no sports. In the yard, there used to be a softball and a bat to bat around a very small yard. You were never permitted to go anywhere in Alcatraz, from one, what was an example, to the hospital or anywhere, without being accompanied by a guard. You were never out of the observation of a guard. Our writing restrictions were much more curtailed, and what we could say was much more censored. And our visiting, instead of being able to see the person whom we were visiting, we would look through a little slot of dark blue glass and talk into an amplifier, a loudspeaker. It was extremely difficult to visit in that manner and terribly humiliating for the families. And that is the main part of the difference, rather, between Alcatraz and the others. And two, on Alcatraz, no man was ever paroled or ever released. He was always transferred to another institution. So there really was nothing to look forward to in Alcatraz at all.
Although never filled to capacity, Alcatraz was designed to house 336 of the worst convicts in the federal system. No one was sentenced to Alcatraz. Every man incarcerated there was from another federal prison and either committed a crime while an inmate or was an escape risk too great for a normal lockup. Most inmates at Alcatraz were little-known hoods, but it was only natural that the super prison of the times should contain the super hoodlums and gangsters of the era. Alphonse Capone, king of the Chicago underworld and known as Scarface, was just prisoner number 85 on Alcatraz. George Machine Gun Kelly was one of the first transfers from Leavenworth Federal Prison and died on Alcatraz 20 years later on his 59th birthday. Arthur Doc Barker of the famous Barker Gang was shot and killed by guards as he attempted to swim away from Alcatraz in 1938. Alvin Creepy Karpus was public enemy number 1 when at large with the Barker Gang, but was considered a coward and unworthy by the other cons on the Rock. Robert the Birdman Stroud never kept birds while on the Rock. He was there for killing a guard at Leavenworth and spent 21 years in solitary confinement on Cell Block D.
The worst inmates in the whole penal service, it was a dumping ground for all the worst ones that they could that they had.
For the inmates, life on Alcatraz was, if nothing else, predictable.
We'd wake them up at 6:30 in the morning. 7 o'clock, they'd go in the dining room for breakfast.
At 6:30, the cell doors were opened and we were marched into the dining room for breakfast.
They were counted after you got them up. They counted them, and then after they ate, they counted them again. And
we were allowed 20 minutes in which to eat. Then we were marched back to our cells, and 30 minutes after that, we marched into the yard.
8 o'clock to be down at the prison industries.
And they counted them again before they left the yard, and then they were going down to the men picked them up out there that took them down into the work area, to work. And they were counted there, and when they got down to work area, they were counted.
Well, they'd come up at 12 o'clock for lunch, return at 1 o'clock for work, come back up at 4:30 for dinner.
Which was around 5:30. We were locked in our cells, and we remained there until 9 o'clock when the lights were shut out.
And they were counted, and the prison was secured for the night.
Typical day of a man doing time on Alcatraz.
And then the next day, it was the same procedure. There was very little variation.
There was work, though, for those who earned the privilege. Alcatraz had the largest laundry on the West Coast that served not only the inmates, but also the United States Army. There was manufacturing, too, in the Industrials building, where military clothing, furniture, and other war materials were produced. On March 21st, 1963, the last few convicts were transferred off the island, and Alcatraz ceased operations as a federal prison. Without maintenance, the deteriorating buildings began to crumble. But in spite of the accelerated decay and decomposition, the historically shunned landmark became the object of a series of unlikely suitors. Less than a year after its closing, Alcatraz was occupied by a small band of Sioux Indians who claimed the island under the terms of a long-forgotten treaty. Competing with the Indians was a group of white men who had filed a placer mining claim under the name Embarrassing Mine. Both were simply ignored by the General Services Administration, and both soon abandoned their claims. But on Thanksgiving Day, 1969, a larger and more determined group of Indians, over 100 strong, claimed Alcatraz for the Indian Nation and began an occupation that lasted over a year and a half and saw the destruction by fire of the warden's house, the lightkeeper's house, and other buildings. There was human drama, too. An Indian baby was born and was celebrated as the first Indian child born in freedom in almost 100 years. Tragically, there was the accidental death of the 12-year-old daughter of Mohawk leader Richard Oakes. On June 11, 1971, a posse of federal marshals escorted the remaining 15 Indians off the island, and Alcatraz became a national park, and as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, a decaying but official landmark of the city. Those who lived on the Rock have memories and opinions as different as their circumstances.
I did enjoy living on the island. We had social activities, sometimes down at the Officers Club. We had some dances. We even had a few wedding receptions there, had card playing. I dated a few girls on the island at the time I worked there. We had about 50 to 60 families. In fact, even at this present time, I belong to the Alcatraz Alumni Association. We meet once a year up in the Russian River area and talk about our old times and meet old friends.
When you first go there, your hope is that you will get a cell that overlooks Berkeley or San Francisco or Marin, you know. And oddly enough, I noticed the old-timers did not want that. They wanted to be down where they couldn't see anything. Well, not I, so I sought a cell where I could see everything. And so I really paid the price every night by looking out the windows.
We had a beautiful 6-room home, and the furniture was all furnished. It was made by prisoners, I think, in other institutions. And everything was just convenient.
And no one goes away from there feeling that it wasn't worthwhile, I'm sure. I've been over there several times myself on different occasions, and it's still a very impressive place, and it served a useful function. The research being done now indicates that there was a place for punishment, for a place with very few privileges and so forth, that it did accomplish something. They're only now beginning to assimilate the data that's been gathered over the years and so forth to see whether Alcatraz had performed a real useful function, and the data is beginning to show that it really did.
It served no purpose, of which I know. The damage it did is almost indescribable in the amount of suicides and insanity that took place. And now that I'm a little older and I have been away from there for 20-some years, I also take a more of an in-depth view of what it did to my family and to the families of other inmates in the institution. They struck out very, very hard at our families who had nothing to do with our original commission of crime. It was a totally unnecessary institution, terribly expensive.
I bid you goodbye with a sigh and a tear. Dear Alcatraz Island, I will miss you. I'll miss all my friends so dear. My heart is broken, I'm sad and blue. Alcatraz Island, I'll never forget you, nor the home I loved so dear. I'll cherish all the sweet memories, too, of the good life I had while living there.
My opinion, when I go back, and I've been back 3 times now, is that, an institution of that nature is just like a horrible cancerous sore in the face of, on the face, rather, of San Francisco. I hold it in the same bitter contempt.